Now it happened as they went that he entered a certain village, and a certain woman named Martha welcomed him into her house. And she had a sister called Mary, who also sat at Jesus' feet and heard his word. But Martha was distracted with much serving, and she approached him and said, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? Therefore tell her to help me. And Jesus answered and said to her, Martha, Martha, you are worried and troubled about many things, but one thing is needed, and Mary has chosen that good part, which will not be taken away from her.
All right, very good. Thank you. Excellent reading. Okay, so before we jump into this, I always like to talk a little bit about the background, and then I want you to think about this, and we'll come back to this at the very end of the lesson. Okay, like the last 5 minutes. The question I always like people to think about is, why is this story recorded? Luke is the only one of the Gospels that has this story. It's only in Luke. And it's only, like I said, about 6 verses. It's very short. So why do you think Luke, and I'm not asking this now, we can ask at the end, why did Luke think it was important to include this story? What does it illustrate? You know, and I think as I was reading over this, it struck me that, you know, if you've read a lot of the other religious books in the world, right? They're teachings or philosophies, but one thing that makes the Gospels different is so much of Jesus' teaching is interwoven into his interactions with people, right? It's not just a list of philosophies. Some is, like Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount. That's sort of his teaching, his philosophies about how we have to live our lives. But so much of his teachings are snippets like this about things that happened in real life with real people, and how he interwove his teachings into those moments. So the first thing I want to talk about before we go on is I want to talk about who Mary and Martha were, right? That this doesn't just sit by itself. Mary and Martha were part of Jesus' life. And I think if we have a better understanding of who they were, maybe a little bit, that will help us understand the story. So one of the places they are mentioned is over in John chapter 11. Let's go over there. John chapter 11. And this is the story of the raising of Lazarus. Now, this is a long story, so we're not going to read all of it. We're just going to read excerpts about Mary and Martha, okay? To just give us an idea of who they were. So in John chapter 11, if someone can read verses 1 through 5.
Now a certain man was sick, Lazarus of Bethany, the town of Mary and her sister Martha. It was that Martha who anointed the Lord with fragrant oil and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was sick. Therefore the sisters went to him, saying, Lord, behold, he whom you love is sick. And Jesus heard that, and he said, This sickness is not unto death, but the glory of God, and the Son of God may be glorified through it. Now Jesus loved Martha and his sister and Lazarus.
Okay. So the first thing we learn about this story that's not in the Luke chapter is that they lived in Bethany. And so I just wanted to put up this map so we can get an idea of how far it was from Jerusalem. And so it's not very far. It's on the backside of the Mount of Olives. And this is a good example because, you know, when we're talking about Jesus going to the Garden of Gethsemane, right, before his crucifixion and praying, it's up on a little slope on the Mount of Olives, and you can look straight across and you can see Jerusalem and you can see the temple. So it's not a very far walk. And so here, Bethany was over here behind the Mount of Olives. Just to give you an idea of the place we're talking about. But now, what does it say? What kind of relationship did Jesus have with Martha and Mary and Lazarus? What does it say about Jesus? He loved them. Okay. And what does that mean here? What does it mean when he says he loved them?
He was close to them.
He was close to them. Right. So clearly, you know, relationships are built on time. And so he clearly had spent a lot of time with them. Yes, ma'am?
He had agape love.
Right. Agape love. And what is agape love?
It's a different type of love than like, say, I love you or
Yep.
you love someone else. It's, how can I put it? It's a different type of love.
It is. It's not just a friendship love. Agape love really means to seek the best for someone. Right? Yes, sir?
That love, agape love, is unconditional love, meaning that
Right.
no matter what the situation may be, that person is objective enough to be able to not necessarily be locked in on the person, but maybe look at the behavior sometimes.
Okay.
To distinguish between the two.
Very good. Yeah, yeah. But in any event, Jesus had a close relationship with these folks. And I want to read just a couple of other verses here. Let's go down and see how Mary and Martha reacted to Jesus and in the raising of Lazarus. Let's go to verse 20. And someone read 20 through 25.
Notwithstanding in this rejoice not, that the spirits are subject unto you, but rather rejoice.
So John chapter 11. If I said 10, I'm sorry.
Okay.
I meant John chapter 11, starting in verse 20.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Then Martha, as soon as she heard that Jesus was coming, went and met him, but Mary sat still in the house. Then said Martha unto Jesus, Lord, if thou hadst been here,
Yeah.
my brother had not died. But I know that even now, whatsoever thou wilt ask of God, God will give it thee. Jesus said unto her, thy brother shall rise again. Martha said unto him, I know that he shall rise again in the resurrection at the last day. Jesus said unto her, I am the resurrection and the life. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live.
Very good. Yes. All right. So Martha comes to Jesus and says, if you would have been here, he wouldn't have died. But what does she confess here? Right. Well, she says, I know that he will rise in the last day. And so she believes in a resurrection, right? She definitely believes in the resurrection. Maybe she doesn't quite understand all of who Jesus is, but she certainly believes, she understands he has power, and she believes in a resurrection. Now, let's go over and see how Mary reacted. Someone read verse 32. Just verse 32.
Then when Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she fell down at his feet, saying to him, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died.
Okay, so both Martha and Mary say the same thing of Jesus. If you had been here, my brother would not have died. So what does that tell you about what they knew about Jesus?
Power.
He had power, yes.
That he would be able to bring him back no matter what. That it didn't matter that he really had died, but that Jesus would take care of it.
Okay, they trusted Jesus to take care of the situation. Yes.
Well, I can see that he could prevent him from dying, so they said if you were here, he wouldn't have died, but they didn't know that he could resurrect him from the dead.
They weren't expecting that, right,
Yeah.
right. But the point is, I think, they understood Jesus had power, and they knew that he could take care of things like that, right? They trusted him to be able to deal with difficult situations in life. And now let's go over to John chapter 12, since we're in John, and we're going to read, because we know this is Mary in this situation. We know this is the same Mary because it says about Lazarus. But in John chapter 12, 1 through 3. John 12, 1 through 3.
Then 6 days before the Passover, Jesus came to Bethany, where Lazarus was, who had been dead, whom he had raised from the dead. There they made him a supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of those who sat at the table with him. Then Mary took a pound of very costly oil of spikenard, anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of the oil.
Okay, so this is another issue of Mary and Martha with Jesus. What's Martha doing?
Working.
Working. She's serving, right? Just like we're going to read about in Matthew chapter 10. And where is Mary? At Jesus' feet. What if in all three of these stories, every story we know for sure that's Mary and Martha, in every story, where is Mary? At the feet of Jesus. In every story. So I think that's very powerful. So what is it, just from reading this, these three stories about these women, what's your general feeling about Martha and Mary? What do you kind of get from them about their personalities?
Martha was the worker.
Okay.
And I think she felt envious or jealous of Mary. Because Mary wasn't working and joining her in doing the work that needed to be done.
Okay.
But Mary felt that Jesus was more important. He was the one doing the big stuff.
Okay, and we're going to talk about that as we delve into the verses. But that's good. Any other thoughts? Yes.
There's always house chores.
Yes, there always are.
Jesus isn't always around.
Right, very
and so
good.
Mary realized that Jesus isn't always going to be around, but Martha has a good heart because she's trying to serve people, fill their energy levels up by giving them food.
Mm-hmm.
And so they're on two different thinking patterns. Martha's the here and now, take care of this. Mary is, Jesus, I'm here for a little while.
Okay, and we'll explore those ideas. And I just wanted to kind of get us thinking about that. So let's go back then to Luke chapter 10, to our text. I'm sorry. Yeah, go ahead.
Martha seems to be very practical.
Uh-huh.
She's practical in the sense that, there's, like Andrew said, there's always something to be done. She's taking care of it. She wants to make sure she's a good host.
Right.
Which would have been expected in that society. I think Mary, she's more spiritual and maybe more about the one-on-one.
Mm-hmm.
That's just mine.
Yeah, no, I think we can definitely see. I mean, anybody who, they wore sandals, right? And they had dirty feet. Anybody that's going to get down, and pour perfume on somebody's feet and then wipe the people's feet with their hair, that is humility. That is humility. And that shows such a, because he's getting ready to go for this, and the story there in John, that's right before his crucifixion. So it gives you the idea that she understood something that maybe even his 12 apostles didn't understand. Like, you're never going to die, Jesus. But she understood something was coming. And so the insight she had and the humility she had, these were two amazing, amazing women. So I want to give you an idea of where Bethany was. And then I also just wanted to, I'm a very visual person, right? So I kind of like to think about what was going on. And this is a picture of what a first century home in Jerusalem would have looked like generally. I mean, they could have been a little bigger, a little smaller, whatever. But this is just a general idea. And down there you see kind of in the middle, I believe would have been sort of the kitchen area. And then you have an area in the front. So you can see people sitting around, meeting, and in this home. And like I said, I kind of like visual pictures. So I just kind of looked for a couple of pictures that might depict this. And so here's one picture I found. And I don't really like this one because here it kind of gives the idea that, it's just Mary and Jesus and Martha. And I don't think that's what exactly we read about in the text. And we'll look at that some more. But here's another one that I kind of like better because it kind of shows maybe how close things were and how, I don't know, I kind of think it gives a better picture of what it might have looked like.
Would you say the other 11 or 12 were with them the whole time?
So that is a good question, and let's go to the text, and because I was going to bring that up. So since you did, let's go ahead and go to Luke chapter 10, verse 38. There we are. All right, and it says, "Now as they were traveling along," so who would have been the they? Do you think? Yeah, and I think that's exactly what you're saying. We don't know for sure. But I don't get the idea that it was just Jesus. He traveled with a posse, right? He traveled with people. Now, there was no telephones He couldn't text them that he was coming. There was no email. So can you imagine, here's Mary and Martha, they're just hanging out at the house, and Jesus shows up with his posse, right? And it could have been 12 other guys. And we don't know for sure, but it says they, so it was more than just Jesus. But they just show up at the house. Now, that we would think that was very rude. Now, how dare someone show up at the house and go, hey, can I stay with you for a while, right? But in the first century, that would have been more expected, right? So that would have been a normal thing. But you can imagine, like I said, unless he had sent somebody ahead and said, we're coming or whatever, if you're the women of the household and a whole bunch of men just show up and say, hey, we're going to stay with you, we need to eat, and then, then there's a lot of work to do. So you can imagine how frantic Martha must have been, right? To get things in order and prepare food for all these people. It wasn't just, oh, I'm going to make Jesus a peanut butter and jelly sandwich, here, right? I mean, there was stuff that had to be done and lots of work to be done. So you can imagine that and how busy she must have been. Now, here's another thing. It says, Martha welcomed him into her home. So it's Martha's home. It's identified like that. So why do you think that was? There's no men mentioned here. But Lazarus isn't even mentioned, but it's just Mary and Martha. Why do you think that was?
Well, she's the elder.
Right? So she's probably the oldest sister, right? And so that makes it her responsibility. And we don't know. Maybe she's a widow, right? Maybe, and so she's taken in her brother and her sister. Maybe she and her sister never got married. That would have been unusual in first century life, but maybe, we don't know. But in any event, the point is this was her home, and she was in charge, and she was responsible, right? It says it's Martha's home. Yeah, go ahead.
It also kind of implies that they might have had wealth. Because think of Mary anointing Jesus' feet. That was very costly ointment.
Yep.
This home would have been at least large enough to accommodate these people,
right,
to a certain degree. And so, and I think there is some tradition that goes along with that as well. So it seems like there's a little bit of in between the lines here. Maybe she had means.
Yeah, she could have been, because we know that the Bible specifically tells us that there were women who were Jesus' disciples who supported him out of their means. And so it's interesting, we see, well, this is kind of a side, but it always sort of annoys me when, people say, well, Jesus had 12 apostles and they're all men, so, only men can serve, Jesus. And Jesus was part of the patriarchy and all that. And that's certainly not true, that women served him in so many ways. And they did things, to support Jesus and support his ministry. And this is just an example, how these two women are open when Jesus and maybe 12 guys just show up and they immediately, want to serve him and be part of his life. Okay, so we see Martha it's her home, so she's responsible, and she's maybe the older sister, and it's her job then to take care of these things. Okay, so in the questionnaire here it says who was woman's sister and what she was doing. Okay, Mary, and so Mary was doing what here? It says in verse 39. She was sitting at his feet, right, and listening to his word. So what does it mean to sit at someone's feet? To learn, yes. And so it could have been both, I think this is both, what am I trying to say?
You put them lower than yourself. You put them above you. You honor them.
It's a sign of humility.
Yes.
Right. And so I think this is meant to be both literal and figurative, sitting at his feet. Because if we go over, let's look at Acts 22 and verse 3. Acts 22 and verse 3. Somebody read that. Acts 22 and verse 3.
I am indeed a Jew, born in Tarsus of Cilicia, but brought up in this city at the feet of Gamaliel, taught according to the strictness of our father's law, and was zealous toward God as you all are today.
So when Paul says he's brought up at the feet of Gamaliel, what does he mean?
It says in the next, it says taught according to the strictness of the law.
It meant he was a disciple. That's what it meant. So they literally sat at the feet of the teacher, but then it became, to use metaphorically, in that you are a disciple of that person. So I think this is literally, she was sitting at his feet, but it's also a way of saying that she was a follower, she was a disciple of Jesus. Okay. And so we can see that attitude of humility. Now, so to me, this is like, you can see, right? So Jesus comes in, he shows up, and then all of a sudden, all this stuff has to be done. So people are busy. Now, I don't know if you've ever been to someone's house, like an elderly relative, and maybe they fought in World War II or they fought in Vietnam, and they start telling stories about what that was like. I don't know about you, but I always want to stop what I'm doing and listen, because you might not have much of a chance to hear those stories again, right? Or maybe they talk about, maybe you had relatives who grew up very, very poor, and they start talking about what that's like. Or whatever it is, something traumatic happened in that part of their lives. Maybe they grew up in the South under segregation, and they have those stories to tell. I don't know about you, but whenever people start telling those dramatic stories, I just want to stop and listen. Because, as someone over here said, you may not, it's like when Jesus shows up, he's not around all the time. But when he is, you want to listen, right? And so when people start telling those stories, you want to listen to them because you may not get a chance to hear them. So I can see that. I can see that Martha gets really busy with all these people showing up, but Jesus starts talking, and Mary wants to listen to that. All right, so I wanted to look at a few more verses that kind of talk about this idea of taking advantage of listening to Jesus. Let's go over to Matthew 5 and verse 6. This is part of the Sermon on the Mount. Matthew 5 and verse 6. Somebody read that.
Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness. They shall be filled.
Okay, so I get this idea that Martha is preparing a meal because people are hungry and thirsty. But Jesus comes back to this idea that blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be satisfied. That's the greater need, right? The greater need that we be filled with righteousness. Let's look at John chapter 6, 32 and 35. John 6, 32 through 35. Somebody read that. John 6, 30. Go ahead.
So Jesus said to them, most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you the bread of heaven, but my Father gives you the bread of heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. Then they said to him, Lord, give us this bread always. And Jesus said to them, I am the bread of life. He who comes to me shall never hunger. He who believes in me shall never thirst.
Okay. So again, this idea that he's saying that partaking of the spiritual bread is more important than the physical bread. And then let's look at one more verse, John 4, 13 through 14. Yeah, go ahead.
You should call that soul food.
Soul food. Yes, you could. You could call it that. Very good. John chapter 4, 13 and 14. Somebody read that for me.
Jesus answered and said unto her, Whosoever drinketh of this water shall thirst again, but whosoever drinketh of the water that I shall give him shall never thirst, but the water that I shall give him shall be in him, a well of water springing up into everlasting life.
Okay, so my point of all this is that there are these teachings of Jesus that are out there, right, that these ladies probably would have known about how he is the bread of life and he is the water of life, and that it's so much more important to be partaking of that, his teachings and who he is, rather than the physical food. And so maybe Mary and Martha had heard these teachings before, and I can see Mary thinking about that as Jesus was there, that Martha's busy with the meal, and she's thinking, yes, but this is more important, because she would have had that sort of to go on. Any thoughts on that? Okay. So let's go back to our text, Luke 10. All right. And so she's sitting there listening to the feet, sitting at the feet of Jesus, listening to him. Now, verse 40. But Martha was distracted with all her preparations. So it's interesting. What does this word distracted mean? What do you think about when somebody's distracted? Yeah, what's that? I heard they can't focus. And so I think that's that they can't focus. So I can see Martha here. The idea is maybe she's trying to listen, and trying to catch part of it, but she can't. She can't just pay attention to it. She can't concentrate on it because she's so concerned about getting the food together, right? And the wine and all that. And so maybe she wants to listen, but she can't. And so have you ever been trying to watch something on TV or listen to something on the radio and you're distracted? Yes, ma'am.
I would call that being discombobulated.
Discombobulated. There you go. That's good. That's a good word. But how does that make you feel? Like if you're trying to listen to something on TV and somebody else is talking to you, or you're trying to watch the movie and somebody else is talking? Oh, doesn't it frustrate you?
But you don't get the full story, the full sentence. You just get snippets.
You get snippets.
So you're not really getting the whole thing.
And so how do you feel? Frustrated. Don't you start getting agitated?
Yes.
I mean, I do. Yeah, irritated.
You want to tell them to be quiet.
You want to tell them to be quiet. Right. And I got to tell you, I can almost not go to a movie anymore because people either talking or looking at their phone. It's just, it drives me crazy. So you can see Martha here. Was Martha, what Martha was doing a right and good thing? Yes. It was absolutely. Is it good to feed the Lord Jesus if he's in your house? Yes. She was doing a right and good thing, right? So let's be clear about that. Somebody had to do that, right? Somebody had to make the meal. But you can see her getting agitated with it, I'm doing all this work and Mary's just sitting there. And so I love the question she asks, what she says to Jesus. Lord, do you not care my sister has left me alone to do the serving? Tell her to help me. So first of all, is she asking him a question? No. This is so passive-aggressive. That's what I would call this. This is so passive-aggressive, yeah. She's venting. She is venting. And who is she rebuking here? Jesus. And that's right. She's rebuking both of them. She is. But what I find interesting is how she frames it, because she says to him, Lord. She calls him Lord. That means master. She recognizes his authority. Whose house is it? Who's in charge of Martha's house? Except when? When Jesus is there. Whose house is your house? Who's in charge of your house? It's your house, but if Jesus is there, who's in charge of your house? Jesus. And I think this is wonderful that Martha recognizes that. It's my house. Why didn't she just tell Mary to get up and go, Mary, come help me serve? Why didn't she just do that? Because that was her younger sister, and it's her house. Why didn't she do that?
It would have been disrespectful to Jesus.
Maybe it was disrespectful to Jesus, but you're right, because it recognizes he's in charge. He walks in, and it's his house, right? Jesus walked in the temple, and it's his temple. Right, go ahead, you two. You first, sorry.
You can't help but, I even though I know she's wrong, I can't help but sympathize with Martha.
Exactly.
I've been in this situation where maybe I should have been paying attention to my company, and I was busy serving, and I felt like I was the only one serving. So I understand what this is like, and I think we all do. And you can sense her frustration in her words. I don't think it's kind of like what Peter said at the Mount of Transfiguration. I don't think she knew what she was saying. She's just talking out of emotion.
Exactly. Absolutely.
I see that as Martha and Mary are friends of Jesus.
Yep.
Jesus come and he served, and so it's just like Jesus. Don't you care that tell Martha to get up in a friendship type of way? Tell Mary.
She was familiar with him.
Yeah.
Right.
You were friends with them.
That shows their friendship, I think, yeah.
It's just like, what are you doing here? Tell your son to come help me, or whatever.
Exactly.
But you have to look at that, said too, back in the first century. I think Landry alluded to that earlier, the road that was there. Here's a bunch of men, women and men didn't, converse with each other back and forth. The women was, the serve
sure.
and that sort of thing. So, Martha, come help me.
Yeah.
Sure.
Sure. I think everyone can sympathize with that. I mean, all of us can. But I think one more thing, let me get back to you in 1 second, and that is, how many of us have been frustrated with Jesus because he's not doing what we want him to do? Lord, I've got a problem. Don't you see, I'm serving and no one's helping me. You need to do something about that, Jesus. How about in our lives? Jesus, I have a problem and you're not fixing it. And we're frustrated with Jesus. Jesus, why aren't you doing what I want you to do in my life? Why aren't you fixing it? Right? You ever been frustrated? That's us. That's Martha. That's Martha in us. When we say to Jesus, I've got a problem, you're not fixing it. You're not doing what I want you to do, Jesus. Why don't you get on that? And we get frustrated with God. And by the way, the Bible is full of those stories. It's not just us. The Bible is full of stories of people frustrated with God because God's not doing what they think he ought to be doing. And did you have your hand up? Oh, okay. We're just stretching. JC does, though.
I've got a couple of real life experiences that I think fit this, but is this a good time to bring them up?
Well, we've got about 10 minutes, so go ahead if they're short.
One church where we had place membership had a fellowship shortly after that, and we found that some of the members during worship went back to the fellowship hall, arranged the food, and after the closing prayer we went in, and they were eating already. They skipped worship to prepare the food for the congregation. Another story is growing up, some women when we had fellowship would skip Sunday school and maybe Sunday school in church to prepare the meal they were bringing for us.
Yeah.
And to me, that's the same thing that's going on here. What's your priorities, physical or spiritual?
Yeah, and so I've heard that. I know of situations exactly like that. Exactly like that. And that's a very good illustration about what our priorities ought to be. But we're running out of time, so I want to move on. And let's look at verse 41. And he answers by saying, Martha, Martha. Why does he repeat her name twice? To get her attention. Okay, that's good. What else do you think maybe?
Emphasis, and also to call her to a higher purpose.
Okay. He often said, truly, truly, or verily, verily, I say to you. Right? He often said that in his teachings. And I think that's right, to get people's attention. But I also think it's a kindness. Right? It's like, Martha, Martha. Right? Like, I think if we were talking to somebody and you want to get their attention, to let them know you're paying attention to them, you might say their name. Like, Art, I hear you, but, right? You know? And so what's the difference, 1 second, what's the difference between how Jesus talks to her and how he talked to the Pharisees when they said something to him? There's a different tone. Can't you see the tone? There's a tenderness here, a relationship. Yeah.
I was just going to say, it's perhaps the tone he used. I see it more of a reproof than a rebuke.
Yeah. Yeah, right. He's calling her attention to something, but in a very different way than how he would have talked to the Pharisees. All right, so he says here, he doesn't tell her, to like, this is the most important thing, why don't you just sit down? He doesn't tell her to stop serving, right? So her serving wasn't the problem. What was the problem? What's that?
Mary's not helping.
Right, that was what she was concerned about. But Jesus doesn't tell her to stop serving, right? He just says, Mary has chosen the most important thing, the thing that's necessary, the good thing. So the problem was Martha's attitude, right? That her frustration, she couldn't do her serving and let Mary have her part, right? She wanted Mary to help her. So the attitude was in her attitude. And so just really quick then, because we're almost out of time, Ernie's back there looking at me. So let's just very quickly, let's just go to John 6:27 real quick. Let's just look at some verses about this. John 6:27. Oh, somebody read that when you get there.
Do not labor for the food which perishes, but for the food which endures to everlasting life, which the Son of Man will give you, because God the Father has set his seal on him.
Right, and so what he's saying is it's all about priorities, right? As we have just talked here. Food is important, but it's not the most important thing. And I want to end on this thought really quickly. He says three things about his teachings in verse 42. What are those three things? What it is what? What's the first thing he says? In verse 42. It's necessary. It is necessary. The second thing is it is the what part? Good. And the third thing is it won't be what? Okay, so it is the teachings of Jesus are necessary, they are good or beneficial, and they will not be taken away. Now, to me, I think of these things I call the outrageous sayings of Jesus, like before Abraham was, I am, the Lord of Sabaoth is here. And he is saying that my teachings are necessary, my teachings are good and beneficial, and my teachings will not be taken away for those that take them in. So either he was the Son of God, or he was a really arrogant guy, right? I mean, if someone came up to me after this class and said, wow, you did a good job. And I said, well, yes, that's because my teachings are good. My teachings are necessary for you, and my teachings will not be taken away from you. Now, that would just make me arrogant and full of myself, right? But if you're the Son of God, you can say that and get away with it. And so I think it just points to, in the end here, that Martha and Mary both knew who Jesus was and that he was important, and they just served him in different ways. And we ought not to be jealous or have bad attitudes towards the different ways people serve, right? Some people, their job is to feed the hungry, literally. Other people make money to give people. Other people teach, and whatever it is, we all have our own ways of service, right? And we should not resent one another. Yeah.
I also feel like they felt like he was family. They were close to him.
Right.
And she felt like she could say that, have Mary get up and work with me.
Right.
So it was from a family point of view, I also think. I mean, she did know who he was. I think she did know who he was.
Right.
Who he was.
Yeah.
And what he could do. But family,
Yeah.
You're here a lot,
Yes. Yeah, I think that's all right. It points to the fact that they had a very close relationship, right?
This is before the brother.
Yes. So I think that's right. I think that if you look at the timeline, this was definitely before Lazarus was raised.
Right, because they both said you could have kept him from dying.
Right, absolutely. But they both had that faith in him. Let me look at one more verse, 1 Corinthians 7:35. 1 Corinthians 7:35. And I think this talks a little about the attitude of Mary and Martha. In verse 30, somebody read that, 1 Corinthians 7:35.
And this I say for your own benefit, not to put a restraint upon you, but to promote what is seemly, and to secure undistracted devotion to the Lord.
To secure undistracted devotion to the Lord. So that's the idea. What was Martha's problem? She was distracted, right? And so it's a word of caution to us that if you're going to serve in the way that you've been given, and do it with undistracted devotion. Yes, sir.
I really think you got it right when you said it was about her attitude.
Yeah.
Because he said you are worried and troubled about many things.
Mm-hmm.
You apply that to us today. We get so worried and stressed out over many things, but then Jesus reminds us just one thing is needed.
Just one thing is needed. Yeah. Right. So in the last couple of minutes here, why this story? Why this story? Why did Luke record this story for us? What do you think?
Remind us not to get caught up in life, and focus on.
Right. and read Matthew 5, 6, and 7, the Sermon on the Mount. That's what most of that is about. In fact, I have those verses written down here, but we don't have time. That's a good one. What else can you take away from this?
Set priorities.
Set your priorities, right. And I think there's a time to serve and there's a time to listen. And this is our time to listen, right? And I think one of the reasons we don't have more people here in Sunday morning Bible class and Sunday morning services is they're distracted and worried by many things, right? Jesus is here. This is the time that's been set aside. You have a chance. I forgot who it was who said over here, Jesus wasn't around all the time. So when the time has been set aside for devotion to Jesus, that's what we need to be doing, right? And not be distracted by many things. Okay, that's good. What else? Any other thoughts?
I take from it that Jesus is every man and woman's Messiah. This is very personal, very relatable.
Yeah.
And to me, it makes Jesus, it's easier for me to connect to Jesus after reading the story.
I agree. And it's also, Jesus acknowledges that Martha is upset and troubled. Martha, Martha, thou art troubled by many things. He acknowledges her, right, and her trouble. And I take comfort in that. When I'm troubled and upset, Jesus acknowledges it. He may not treat it. He might not do what I want him to do, but he acknowledges it and says, and he calls us back to the most important thing. Last comment.
It's verse 39 of Luke 10. And I'm kind of going